stay here with me.
Well, that was Money Honey by Ella Mae Morse, and this is Marie McCary on BCB 106.6 FM with Why Don't Economists, a show about different thinking in economics. Well, as often explained in previous shows, the problem we have with mainstream economists is that they don't have money, debt and banking in their models. The biggest blind spot is not considering how money is created in the first place. The 3% of the money supply that is cash is created by the Bank of England, but the 97% that is digital is created by the privately owned banks when they issue loans. The recent highways bill in the USA is using money from the Federal Reserve for highway maintenance and building. If this can be done in the home of free market economics, why can't the Bank of England finance much needed flood defences and railway upgrades in the north of England? It would put so many people back into work and they'd become taxpayers rather than benefit recipients, and it would all pay for itself in so many ways. It would certainly not be inflationary. All avenues of getting newly created money to work for the public benefit must be considered. The present way is causing tremendous instabilities, but another way of creating money for the public benefit is to have publicly owned banks rather than privately owned banks and let them create money for the public interest. This is done in Germany, for example, at the local, regional and national levels and works really, really well. My guest today is Dr. Thomas Marois of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, who has been studying the effects of public banking in developing countries. I started by asking him the question I always ask first: why don't economists?
And why don't economists, take seriously the idea that state-owned banks or public banks are not inherently good or bad, to allow for a more genuine and realistic discussion? Mainstream economists look at public banks as inherently bad, that bureaucrats are inherently self-interested and they make bad bankers. And this is a line that's been repeated quite often through sort of the big developmental institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, but it makes its way through the whole of mainstream economics. And it's their assumption about individuals are corrupt, and therefore if someone's in the government, then they're going to use something like a bank to their own interests. But on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of alternative economists, even in developmental ones, maybe bend the stick too much the other way and say that simply because a public bank is public, then it's inherently good. But there can be problems with that as well. So I guess the answer to the question is that economists need to take seriously that they're not inherently anything. There's a lot of potential in public banks and in the good they can do, and that needs to be reclaimed. But it's not simply because they're either public or private that a bank is good. But it's what a community puts into it.
Yes, but private banks have a commission, fees and bonus structure, so the employees are going after money for themselves individually, whereas public bank employees just get a salary. Doesn't that completely change motivations and the type of people working there?
Absolutely. So this is a very important point that you're bringing up. So again, there's a structural difference between a lot of private banks and public banks. So private banks must turn a profit to survive, and that has become increasingly intense over the last 20 or 30 years. So they can't exist without chasing profit. And public banks can do that in a sense. They can exist, and they have for decades, without a profit mandate. And this makes a fundamental difference. But there's an important but here, and that's that over the last 20 or 30 years, the free market mentality has become very powerful. And in a lot of cases, the area that I study in the global south, that has penetrated public banks. So now in a lot of areas, the governments have put new restrictions on public banks that they must be profit-oriented. And that then has an impact in the way in which they can respond to developmental goals, collective goals, to progressive alternatives. So this is my point where I started, that you don't want to essentialize it as inherently good, but what you need to do is shape public banks and decide collectively, no, maybe we don't want a profit motive. That the goal of a public bank that we're going to determine politically, and this is a problem where economists, they don't want to get into that.
Yes.
They don't want any political determination over public banks. They only want either to be privatized, which is the best option for mainstream free market economists, or for the public banks to act as if they were private. And this is what's happened quite a bit and where public banks still exist today.
Yeah, so if public banks had a mandate for the public benefit only, rather than having a particular mandate for profit, then they tend to be for the public benefits when they're, it's when they're skewed towards copying the private banks, really, and going for profit motive.
Yeah, that's where the trouble begins, I think, is that they lose sight of their public ethos and their sort of mandates to serve in the public interest. And a lot of the research I've done in public banks, you see quite a difference between, for example, high-level managers that might have been brought in to manage a bank and the frontline workers. And a lot of the frontline workers that I've interviewed in real existing banks, public banks, particularly in Turkey, that deal in agriculture or local development or tradespersons or funding co-ops, the frontline workers take real pride in the fact that their bank is serving their community, that they have a link to the community, and that it's not just about profit, that they have tried to privilege the needs and the aspirations and the goals of their community, and that's a real source of pride for them.
Do they promote from within, or do people come in from private banks to be the bosses of these banks that you mention?
Again, it depends, and it depends on what point in history you're talking about. So in the past, up until the rise of free market orthodoxy, a lot of the promotion was internal. However, in a lot of cases, what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that to sort of respond to these new market goals that have been imposed on public banks so that they're profitable, so they respond to what the International Monetary Fund, what the World Bank want them to do, which is make money rather than serve the public interest. Now they've started to place, they'll put private sector managers in or bring in somebody from the private sector to run the public banks according to more profit-oriented or marketized goals.
Because it's interesting that, because I know someone who's dealing with the Sparkassa outreach people in Ireland, and apparently they're saying that it doesn't really suit private bank managers to be transferred across to the public bank because they just don't have the right ethos, and it's difficult to retrain them. Better to train yourself, promote from within, as you were saying, from the frontline workers who have the public ethos and are proud of it.
Yes, yeah.
So in your view, if you have public banks that have purely the benefit of the public in mind, that works out much better?
Yes, absolutely. I definitely advocate on behalf of that. But I guess I put it in the way of we need to reclaim the sense of what we mean by public, because that in a sense has been stolen from us under neoliberalism. We get the sense today that people who work in the bureaucracy are bureaucrats are lazy, that anybody in the public sector has this golden parachute, and that you sort of sit around until your retirement, and we could all work harder, and in a sense the public sector has really been vilified.
Yes.
By mainstream economists, and it's simply not true. Public sector work really hard, and often for less pay and long hours, and they do a hell of a job of what they do.
Well, you just have to look at junior doctors and teachers and what they're saying at the moment.
Precisely. And they don't necessarily do it only for their own interest, but the way that mainstream economists, their worldview, is that people can't do anything but in their own interest.
Yeah, they cannot get their head around that people actually want to help other people, and that their prime motivation is not just maximising their pay.
That's right. But I do want to caution, though, too, that you do have to be careful. And in public banks, in banking in general, they're very powerful institutions. The control, the ownership and control and management of money confers a lot of power.
Well, they create money. The thing is, they create money out of nothing, which is, and the Sparkasse in Germany, over 70% goes into small and medium businesses, and only 2% of the money created by the private banking sector in Britain goes towards small and medium businesses. Well, that makes a big difference to the state of the economy.
It does, yeah, and the opportunities that people have to prosper, to do something with their small business or their family. A lot of public banks invest in their local community in terms of parks and transportation, healthcare, greening of public buildings, specialized loans, reduced loans, these sorts of things. A lot of really important things you can do that are positive and good for your community if you have control over money.
Well, exactly, and control over the creation of money and where that money goes, in what direction that money goes to.
Yeah, money and credit, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I think the key point where we have to progress in this debate is that there needs to be a democratization of credit and a real substantive dialogue and control and accountability over public banks if it's something that's going to be promoted here in UK, but also elsewhere. There needs to be an accountability of that.
Is there anywhere that is happening? Because it's so complicated to explain to people.
Sure. I don't know if there's any perfect example anywhere, but I can give you some examples of how this occurs. One example I like is a bank in Costa Rica, a small Central American nation, very progressive in many ways, very green, developmentally oriented, very sensitive to questions of women and development and gender. And so they have this one bank, it's called the Banco Popular Bank, People's Bank in a sense. And it's a bank that's actually it's public, but it's owned and controlled by workers in the country, and the major decisions are made in the sort of cooperative workers like annual shareholders meeting. So their collective decisions are made that way, but they also have specific committees within the bank where they have oversight in terms of the credit and loans given, in terms of their environmental impact, but also their impact on women and gender inequality. Another example you can look to is a different sort of model, a little more elitist, sort of top-down, but nonetheless more representative, would be the State Bank of India, where their Board of Governors is mandated to include representatives from their bank workers' unions, management representatives, but also representatives from the government, not only just the Treasury, but also from the Ministry of the Economy and Development and things like that. So you get greater representation in the decisions made in the board, for the actual bank itself. So you begin to see elements of democratization. And I think this is something where we can be very creative and make really serious demands on public credit, public banks, and what to do with that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, so the board of the bank could be from many areas of society.
Absolutely.
Local businesses as well, if it was a local bank.
Yes, yeah. They don't want to see economics and politics mixing.
Politics is about the public benefits. You can't have, if you just leave banks to the free market, you get 2008, etc., and all the mis-sellings and the manipulations and fraud that's been going on. Terrible corruption at the moment, It's no wonder that that study on the culture of banks was abandoned, because God knows what it would have come up with.
And mainstream was always pointing to the cases where there have been problems, or in saying that their public banks are all inefficient, but they can't really account for specific cases of public banks where they've done really well.
It's strange that mainstream economists think like that, because if you look at the most successful European economy, which is definitely Germany, they only have 40% of private banks, 20% are mutual and cooperative, and 40% are public banks, local, regional or national, and look at the success they've made of it in Germany. Yet they diss the thought of public banks. It's quite bizarre, really.
Yeah, indeed.
How can they ignore all the bad decisions made by the private banks and say they're better, I mean, and you look at China as well, which has developed massively in the last 20 years, and they've got lots of public banks also,
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem for a free market paradigm in that a lot of the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa,
Who are
which
the main
no doubt,
countries that have been growing, in the past 20 years.
yes, but also now we have to be fair, they're entering a bit of a crisis right now. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that the significance of the public banks have played a major role in their growth spurts over the last decade, 15 years or so. And this has given rise to the other kind of major multilateral, like global initiatives, the New Development Bank, which is the development bank set up by the BRICS, which is an important aspect of the whole idea of public banking, which is trying to scrape out some autonomy to make some local decisions or decisions that aren't structured or determined by global forces like the IMF or World Bank, as is the other one, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a similar type of initiative. And all of these are government-owned banks, and they're specifically designed to fill this gap of funding long-term, funding projects that communities or economies need, but over the long term in ways that they can support these initiatives without being purely profit-driven. Yeah, in the wake of the big global crisis, is something that the mainstream has had to admit, is that in the cases where there were significant state-owned or public banks, that amidst the crisis, they did what they went counter-cyclically.
Yes.
So they didn't make the crisis worse. They didn't necessarily call back their loans at times of crisis to protect their bottom line, but they continued to lend. In many cases, increased lending to help stabilize the economy, or to help out farmers, or to help out tradespersons or small businesses, that sort of thing. And they can do that quite effectively because they're not always strictly determined by profit, and so they can look after the public interest much more easily that way. It's exactly the value of a public bank, is that you can use that money for good, and in terms of people's jobs and
good
things
for
like that. But
good for society, good for the public, not good for shareholders, and good for the bonuses of the bankers.
Yes, yeah. But they do, and I insist on this point, they do have to be held accountable. And transparent, and the makeup of the bank, the loans and the credits made available really need to be done in a way that promotes equity. Yes, I think, and this is, again, another the important aspect, is that a public bank can, in a sense, be released from only looking after profits and shareholder returns. Exactly. But I just wanted to expand, because you were talking about the outreach program. Because the point I want to make is that there is nothing essential about a public bank, but if there is great potential, because being located within the public sector also means that you can be released a little bit from the sort of competitiveness that you would find that is necessary or inherent to the private sector. So private banks will never share information willingly with their competitors. But in the public sector, you can get things like this public outreach and helping people set up other public banks.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And the other really important element to that is that public banks can also have an important role in supporting other public sector services. In supporting their sustainability, in supporting cooperative movements. And other elements.
That's it. I know somebody who works in trying to get failing companies that want to become cooperatives, but they can't get the funding from the private banks, but they could possibly from public banks who don't want to see companies fail. And also they provide banking to remote areas that are not particularly profitable for the private banks. That's another thing they do.
Yeah, I was recently in Uruguay talking about public banks and the public sector, and they have a very impressive and reclaimed public sector there, and very strong workers' movement, union movement. And I was speaking with the representatives of the union and the largest public bank there in Uruguay, which is state-owned, a public bank. They have a bank workers union. And they were talking about how recently they had opened up a fund specifically to support workers who had recuperated closed factories.
Yes.
And it was geared exactly to that, where factories in the private sector shut down for whatever reason, but the workers wanted to reclaim that factory and open it up on themselves, but hadn't been able to find funding. So this public bank opened up a very specific fund to do that.
Oh, that's fantastic, yeah.
I mean, you're not going to see HSBC do that. You're not going to see RBS do that.
It was interesting you mentioned Uruguay because I saw at the recent Paris environmental conference that Uruguay has a very high amount of
green energy.
Yeah, green energy.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder if they've got a big public bank funding that. And so I Googled it. And yes, they do have a big public bank funding green energy. And I thought, well, there you go.
Yes. And there was another example I know of in Turkey, an imperfect example, but one of their large local public banks called Halkbank was giving very specific credits to public universities to help them retrofit the large university buildings to reduce energy consumption. So it was subsidized credits given to another public sector institute specifically to help the environment.
Yes,
These are fantastic
and then the
programs.
public institute saves money then, which it can then pay back its loan.
Exactly.
So it's a virtuous circle, isn't it? Well, the idea of the upcoming conference really is that there probably is a financial crisis coming up, and we need to have public banking on the table. Last time the government did take over banks, but they didn't then start using them for the public interest, and this time the banks need to be investing into the productive sector, into infrastructure to create jobs for the real economy, not going into the financial sector, because I think it's 51% of loans, that is new money for the private banks in England, go towards housing, and 32% go towards the financial sector. So the money goes towards already existing assets, which then increase in value. So the asset holders become richer. The rich become richer and the poor become poorer, because they have the rest of the debt. That's just not the recipe for a prosperous economy at all.
No. And that's why you need to exert control over it and move away from speculative, assets, gains, and more towards being concerned with people's real lives, their jobs, their families, their health, their education, these kinds of basics.
The benefit of society, the benefit of the real economy. This is what banks are supposed to be there for, why they have this position and why they were rescued to the tune of billions of pounds, trillions of dollars in America, and they just don't operate like that. It's ridiculous.
Social movements who don't really necessarily want to talk about this or feel about it have to raise this idea of systemically important public banking alternatives beyond things like just local currencies or small community banks. You need large, powerful, democratized banks to guide investment that is going to support a break with free market orthodoxy and to challenge the big banks.
Never hear
very,
about
very
this in England. We never hear about these options that happen in other countries. It's just not spoken about even in the alternative economic sphere, really, to be quite honest. The Greens don't seem to be talking about public banks at all. I've spoken to Natalie Bennett twice, and she doesn't seem interested, really. It's very bizarre. And yet other green parties in other parts of Europe are fully on board, particularly Ireland.
This would be another answer to your question about why don't mainstream economists do this. And to rephrase this is that what we need to do to reclaim the potential of public banking is to begin to reclaim the idea of what we understand to be efficiency. And private mainstream understands of banking efficiency is effectively profitability. When we strip away everything, it's about how much money can they make with a given amount of limited resources. Efficiency in a progressive public sector sense might have very little to do with profitability, but with does that bank support overall economic stability and development in your community? Does it do it over the long term? Does it promote a healthy environment? Does it promote a healthy family environment to grow up in, educational opportunities?
different criteria to be measured entirely.
What do we mean by efficient? Do we mean socially efficient, or do we mean efficiency in the bottom line?
Well, I always thought that economics was about a system of providing the maximum benefit to the maximum number of people, how to organise yourself. It's a man-made system, but it doesn't do that at all. It's all the benefits going to a very small percentage, with big problems for a very large percentage, which for a man-made system, why are we organised like that? That's not efficient.
Well, it's organised like that because, frankly, people have pushed for changes in their own interests. I mean, the changes here are 20 or 30 years
people,
are not by accident. It's because, powerful bankers, industrialists, advocates of market economics, they push their interests. They're, in a sense, capital became the most revolutionary class of all, if you will, over the last 20 or 30 years.
They're very parasitical, and they're killing the host, basically, as Professor Michael Hudson is saying in his latest book. Yeah. Very much in danger of killing the host, It
can be, yeah. But until people organize and build capacity to resist that, it's not just going to change itself. Let's put it that way.
No, well, I think it's going to be through crashes, unfortunately, that we have to have things on the table ready for the next crash. And
that indeed we do have to be ready for, and that is a shortcoming of alternative economists, of the left, of organized labor, is that we haven't seriously addressed this question of challenging finance.
This is so true.
Yeah, this is the major problem, and I argue for the potential of reclaiming public banks and for the need of it, but I'm not naive to think this is the only thing we have to do. But it's absolutely vital. It's absolutely central to all the other alternative initiatives out there.
This is what absolutely motivates me in what I'm doing at the moment, is why doesn't the sector look thinking about the public interest? Why aren't they looking at public banks? It's nobody's talking about it.
The reason why I would suggest that it's very little talked about is because if you take control of finance, then the game changes. That this is the control, the democratized control of money and credit, or public control of that, threatens the most powerful interests that define our economic system today, that define financialization.
That is so true. That is the crux of the matter, and that's why we have to fight it. Well, thanks very much to Dr. Thomas Marois for his insights into public banking in the Global South. I think local public banking should be looked at by the Scottish and Welsh authorities and also by the northern cities as a way of promoting local prosperity and getting money into local industry. The authorities would also have safer banking for their own money, as public banks are so much less likely to fail if, like the Sparkasse, they are forbidden to delve into derivatives. And also, local public banks would provide cheap loans for projects such as affordable housing, which would pay for themselves and easily provide an acceptable business plan. And of course, the profits of the local public banks go back to the local authorities, which can be used for all kinds of projects. Last year, I was getting really annoyed about how public banking was just not being talked about in the UK. And I started organising a public banking conference in Manchester with the hope that the people in the Devomanx would start looking at this option. With Manchester being the first northern city to be given devolved powers, I found the locals were very suspicious that this was a very top-down initiative to defer blame for cuts onto the local Labour administration rather than the central government. But local public banking could be a way around this. Surprisingly for me, once I got started, the most important thinkers in this area agreed to come and speak at it, including even Ellen Brown from California, the author of the amazing book, The Public Banking Solution, and president of the Public Banking Institute. And also Professor Richard Werner, who is Professor of International Banking at Southampton University. He is a total expert on international banking and very much a proponent of change. Also, Thomas Marois will be there, and Noel Keenahan, who's a public banking campaigner from Ireland, where the SBFIC, which is the Sparkassa outreach programme, has visited many times. And 3 of the political parties in the upcoming elections in Ireland will have public banking in their manifestos. So this conference will be taking place at the Friends Meeting House on Saturday, February the 20th, and tickets can be got on Eventbrite. So I'm really happy that Ellen Brown will be meeting with quite a few British politicians whilst she's in the UK. The politicians need to hear from proponents of public banking rather than private banking people who obviously have an agenda against public banking. But whether public banking will start to be discussed properly in the mainstream media is another matter, for it is the private banker's nightmare. So that's it for now. See you in another 4 weeks, and I'm going to be really busy organising this conference. And I'll leave you again with Money Honey by LMA Morse.
You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, "Money, honey, yes. Money, honey, yes. Money, honey, if you want to stay here with me." I was clean as a screen and so hard pressed. I called the man that I love best. I finally got my baby about 3:30. He said, "I'd like to know